MC Gaines, his first name Max, his last name Ginsberg. Like a lot of American Jews whose immigrant parents changed their names coming over from Russia or Eastern Europe, so did he. And like a lot of American Jewish men in the early 20th century, he was a salesman. He worked for Eastern Color Printing. They did newspapers. And one day he's throwing out papers and he's reading the comics, and he loves the comics. And he says, you know, the comics actually sell the paper. If we folded it over once and twice and stapled it, MC Gaines creates the comic book as we know it, reprinting newspaper comic strips ganged up in that size. But they run out of material. They need new material. He teams up with a couple of pulp publishers, Donenfeld Leibowitz, son of immigrant American Jews, and they start creating new material for these things called comic books, with the themes of adventure and fun and thrills. The first comic book with a single theme. But then they want something bigger and better. Sheldon Mayer, son of immigrant Jews, comes up with a feature that their young Jewish writer and artist, Siegel and Schuster, do. It's Superman in the first issue of Action Comics. Isn't Superman a Jewish story of an immigrant boy coming from a Holocaust? Isn't it the Moses story? Aren't all the Jewish superheroes come from Jewish origins? Even the ones wrapped in the American flag? Isn't Captain America really Captain Israel? Ladies and gentlemen, the 92nd Street Y presents Jews in Comics. And my name is Arlen Schumer. And the presentation is brought to you by, or approved by, the Kosher Comics Authority. What the? The Kosher Comics Authority? Of course, I don't make fun of comics. I have fun with comics. I based it on that seal in the upper right corner of every comic book you ever saw. But what if I told you the same guy who designed the Comics Code seal also designed, if you look back to Superman number 11 in 1940, and you go up in the upper right corner, what do we see but the beginnings of the famous DC Bullet logo? The same guy designed that, designed the seal, and also the Superman logo itself. I call it the Coca-Cola of comic book logos. Now, what if I told you, if you went down to 34th Street to the Penn Station Post Office and looked at the Roman letters, neither rain nor snow nor gloom of night, and then you go down the street to the public library and you look at the Roman letters engraved there, the same guy that designed the Superman logo on the Comics Code stamp of the DC Bullet designed the Roman letters, and nobody knows his name. Ira Schnapp, one of the Jews in comics. He designed every DC Comics logo you could think of. He came, like all the American Jews of the 20th century, from Eastern Europe, from Sasau in Poland. His family was a family of stonecutters. There's his family crest. That's why he was able, as a teenager in 1912, to sketch out the Roman letters on tracing paper and give it to the the marble engravers and create those Roman letters. Same guy designed the Superman logo. That is how it first appeared in issue number 6 in 1940, because when issue 1 debuted the year before, look at the logo. That was done by the original artist, Joe Shuster. Most artists don't know anything about typography, especially comic artists, but the lettering is so important. But you can see from Joe Shuster's original sketch years earlier, from the early 30s, how that telescopic lettering was always their idea. This was the original drawing of Superman that eventually became the Superman comic strip that Siegel and Schuster all through the 30s were trying to sell, except they couldn't sell it. The dream of all young artists then at the birth of comic book was still to get a newspaper strip. That was the adult medium, newspapers. That was where the big money was. Well, an editor named Sheldon Mayer for the fledgling DC Comics needed material for this new Action Comics that he knew Donenfeld and Leibowitz were planning. And out of the slush pile of rejected comic strips, something about that Superman comic strip clicked. According to Sheldon Mayer, it was the dual identity of Clark Kent and Superman that appealed to him. Because he was a literate man, he knew that novels from the turn of the century and the early 20th century that dealt with dual identity, like the Scarlet Pimpernel, who is a socialite by day like Bruce Wayne and fights crime at night. Then, of course, there were the swashbuckling silent films with the first action hero, Douglas Fairbanks, as Zorro. So there were precedents for the dual identity of Clark Kent and Superman. But Mayer also realized that they were thinly disguised autobiographical images of Siegel and Schuster themselves, shown here looking at their own creation. And that's why Sheldon Mayer brought this early Superman comic to Max Gaines. Now, Max Gaines, again, first name Ginsberg, along with Donenfeld and Leibowitz, were all sons of Jewish immigrant parents. One was from Romania, one was from Ukraine. Just like the Jews in Hollywood, according to Neal Gabler's book, if you've read it, all of them were sons of Eastern European Jewish immigrants. William B. Mayer, Samuel Golden, Jack Warner. So too were the early comic book moguls, also cut from the same cloth. Now, when Gaines hooks up with Donenfeld and Leibowitz, they're working with a major, Malcolm Wheeler Nicholson, not Jewish. He's doing pulp stories, look at his credit in the left, that are filled with action and adventure. And he loves this early medium of comic books. So the early, what eventually became DC Comics, were actually Malcolm Wheeler Nicholson's ideas. But sooner or later, their third success, Detective Comics, the first book of original material built around a single theme, by this time, Donenfeld and Leibowitz kind of edged Nicholson out, and they took the name National Periodical Publications and started what then became known as DC Comics because of Detective Comics. There's a whole story. The granddaughter of Major Nicholson is trying to get his name back out there as really the creator of the content of comic books. MC Gaines created the form of it, but really Wheeler Nicholson is really responsible for the content of the early comics. So after the success of Detective, they come up with the name Action Comics. This was what's called an ash can edition, which means a black and white copy not meant to be sold, just meant to secure the copyright. My intellectual property lawyer, Mark Reiner, can back me up on that, right, Mark? The ash can edition, because after they secured copyright, it was thrown into the ash can. But they ended up putting Superman on it. This is a photo from a 1938 New York newsstand. If you look down below, what do you see? But that first issue of Action Comics. When you opened it up, these were actually newspaper Superman comics that were pasted up on the pages for the first story. When Siegel and Schuster sold it to DC in 1938, they were paid $10 for 13 pages. I told PBS when they filmed me for a superhero documentary a couple of years ago, I said it was the biggest ripoff to take place in Manhattan Island since the Indians sold it for $26. Boy, tough crowd. You know what I'm saying by a tough crowd? Wow, at least they liked it. Anyway, if you look at that first mock-up, over the years, they eventually re-mocked it up again and again whenever they wanted to tell the origin of Superman. But once again, if you look at the very first panel, the very first story, the idea that a kid is being sent from a planet that was experiencing a Holocaust and being sent to an alien world known as Kansas to be raised up and become a superhero is essentially the Jewish story of Moses, where he is sent downriver to escape the Egyptian slaughtering of the Jewish firstborn and grows up to become the first, the great super prophet. Years later, of course, we get a Superman cover like this in Egypt. Superman is all the biblical Jewish heroes rolled into one. There's a little bit of the David and Goliath because Superman always helped the underdog. Of course, there's Samson breaking his chains and bringing down the entire temple. The idea of Superman busting through chains was a motif seen early on. A lot of people think the Jews were passive through history. How can they when we celebrate Hanukkah every December, celebrating the great warrior Judah Maccabee? How about in 70 AD when they destroyed Jerusalem? This is a picture of Masada, the great Jewish warriors that held off the Roman legions for months against all odds, no different than the Warsaw Ghetto Jews held off the Nazis for months 2,000 years later. What about in 115 AD, the Bar Kokhba rebellion? They thought Bar Kokhba was the Messiah. That's an old engraving. Here's actually a 19th century opera dedicated to Bar Kokhba, the great Jewish warrior, who was slaughtered by the Romans along with everybody else, obviously not the Messiah. The other great Jewish warrior that Superman was based on was Popeye. Yes, the Max Fleischer cartoons. He's a Jewish warrior. He was Max Fleischer. They were Jewish animators with their parents from the old country. Of course, but Popeye would eat his spinach. Siegel and Schuster were watching these cartoons in the mid-30s, and they looked at the feats of super strength that Popeye performed, and they said to each other, if we could have a realistically drawn character doing those feats, we would have something. And that's what was recognized in the very first Superman drawings that eventually made it onto Action Comics #1. Recently, when they had some Popeye comics, they paid back the favor. Of course, the real homage was the fact that the Fleischer Studios produced in 1941, 2 years after Superman debuts, overnight success. And what's great about these cartoons, and I do a whole lecture based on these cartoons, who's never seen the Max Fleischer Superman cartoons? You've all seen them? Greatest realistically animated cartoons of all time, partly because they were so faithful to Joe Shuster's original drawings. Now, when you go back to that first page, look at the lower left panel here. What do you read here? But right from the get-go, Superman is a champion of the oppressed. Now, when you go back to Jewish history, where do you find a hero created to save the Jews from oppression? You go back to 16th century Prague in Czechoslovakia for the legend of the Golem. The Golem is this being made out of clay. That's what the Hebrew word means, made from clay. According to legend, a real rabbi in the 16th century Jewish ghetto named Rabbi Love, L-O-E-W, pronounced love, wanted to save the Jews from the oppressive pogroms, the riots, the raping, the robbing, the pillaging, the murder of the Jewish communities all through Christian Europe throughout the Dark Ages and, well, throughout 2,000 years, basically. But every now and then, so the legend grew up where, maybe from learning secrets from the Kabbalah, the Jewish mysticism, Rabbi Love engraves upon the being's forehead the Jewish word emet, which means truth. And that brings the Golem to life to basically start saving the Jewish people from the pogroms. There was a movie made in, I think it was a Polish film, made in 1926, which gives us the image of the Golem that, if any image has kind of made it out there into the pop culture, it's this one. The problem with the Golem, or Golem, is that since it didn't have a mind or a soul, after it saved the Jewish people, it starts killing the Jewish people as well as the Gentiles, because it doesn't have a soul, it doesn't have a mind. That's the metaphor, that only God can create life, not man. So what does Rabbi Love do? By removing the F from emet, you're left with the word met, which means true, which means death. And the Golem was put down. According to legend, if you go to the Prague Jewish area, my friends here are going to Prague in a little while, into the famous Jewish synagogue in the Jewish quarter there. Steven Soderbergh made a movie called Kafka about 15 years ago, great film, and it takes place in that Jewish synagogue. According to legend, the Golem is up there. Now, where do we see this legend making it across the pond into America? Well, first of all, 200 years after the Golem legend begins, Mary Shelley writes the story Frankenstein in the early 19th century. It's essentially the same story, which becomes a metaphor for all of Jewish culture, is that it eventually gets absorbed or assimilated into the wider culture. The Frankenstein story is essentially the Golem story. And it was films like this that the young Siegel and Schuster were seeing. But in the 1930s, there was a monster going across Europe for real. It was this guy. And stories were beginning to seep over after World War II begins in 1939 with the mass slaughter of Jewish communities as the Nazi Wehrmacht goes across Russia and slaughters Jewish communities in their paths. Stories like this, if not the photographs themselves, would appear. And that's why you somehow feel that either unconsciously or subconsciously in the story of Superman. Yet right from the get-go, from the very first issue, you get a story like this, where Superman is not a warmonger. He doesn't use his incredible fists to solve problems, or does he? This is a story about him going to the Eastern European dictators. This is in the late 30s. And if they don't negotiate, he's going to bring the pillar down on them. Look at this other story, similar, where he basically says the same thing. He's going to make them fight amongst themselves. But as World War II kicked in, eventually Superman does, in a proxy way, start taking on the actual characters of Hirohito and Hitler right there. And if you look at the actual art that Siegel and Schuster are holding there, that is that cover. Now, what's interesting about Superman's iconography is that it was the exact opposite of this terrible symbol. The Superman S is as well known and the polar opposite of that symbol. It was what America had to counter images like this. The comic books gave us patriotic images like this. The shield itself, if you look at Superman's chest symbol, this is actually one of the very first costumes that Schuster had made and hired an actor to wear. This is 1939. And they say Superman's shield was based on a policeman's shield. And in the 1939 World's Fair, right here in New York, was the very first appearance of Superman as a real figure. A couple of years later, when the war kicks in, everybody's saying, why doesn't Superman actually fight the war as if he were real? So in this issue of Look magazine, Siegel and Schuster actually create a 2-page story where Superman actually goes to Europe and fights, the Nazis and Hitler, and at the very end, why it was done in this weird 2-color job, nobody really knows. Couple years later, DC Comics reprints it and they add the color. A couple years ago in France, they actually had an art exhibition that collected all of these examples that the Nazis themselves actually used as propaganda to say that they were going to defeat what they call the Übermensch, the Superman. Now, it really wasn't until 1965, 50 years ago this year, that the first great history book about comics came out, The Great Comic Book Heroes by the great Jules Feiffer. Here's a picture of him from the 1950s when he was an assistant to Will Eisner, who's another great Jew in comics that we will talk about a little bit later in my presentation. But it was Feiffer, the writer, who in the body of the book wrote essays about all the superheroes, and he's the one that really first put out the idea that Superman wasn't from Krypton, he was from Minsk. And that's why I think in the early 90s, it really wasn't until the Village Voice does this story where they come right out and call him Super Jew. And that really kicks off, in the last 20 years, the wealth of knowledge and research into the Jewish roots of the superheroes, with, of course, the punny titles, yes, Up, and Oy Vey. I don't write them, I just show them. Disguised as Clark Kent, written by Danny Fingeroth, who wrote Spider-Man for Marvel Comics. Recent books like this, they don't want to pay the licensing fee to DC Comics, so they just do generic. You see what your business has wrought, Mark? Crappy covers like this because nobody wants to pay the licensing fee to use Superman. Time Out magazine a couple of years ago brings back the new Super Jew with, the new generation that's standing up for their Judaism. There's He magazine, which, now who did I say? Mark is wearing that shirt basically. That is, of course, the Shin, the Hebrew letter Shin, which we've seen on art that I find all over the internet of images like this. To me, again, they're a little over the top, they're a little goofy. I'm not really sure is that supposed to be the word like love? I don't really know. Who can translate that? What does it mean in English? So he's a Levite. Okay, there we go. Well, I also found this. God bless the internet, man. You'll find stuff like this all the time. This is the image that I used in my opening introduction. But the guy that guided Superman for 30 years, from the 40s to 1970, that gives you everything the mainstream knows about Superman, came from the mind of one of the great Jews in comics, Mort Weisinger. Mort Weisinger starts editing Superman the year that this comes out in 1940. He shepherds the character through the 50s. The TV show, Truth, Justice, and the American Way, comes from the worldview of Weisinger. It was really his muse, the artist Kurt Swan, my first favorite artist that I grew up with, a whole generation grew up with, that gives us the ideal Superman. Drawings like this, penciled by Kurt Swan, wash tones by Jack Adler, the head colors of DC Comics, and Howard Stern's cousin. That's why Howard, a great Jew in comics, always talks about comics, because of his cousin, Jack Adler. It was during Weisinger's reign that some of the greatest stories that were quite morbid for 8-year-old boys to read, but some of his greatest stories were actually called imaginary stories about Superman dying. And I think any of us that read these stories, we all choked back childhood tears when we read these things, because Kurt Swan's artwork made the stories seem so real. Right, Joe? Yeah. So emphatic. Thank you. One of his greatest stories in 1964. Now remember, Weisinger didn't write the stories per se, but as editor, he co-plotted with the writers. These reflect Weisinger's worldview, that what if Superman didn't use his powers to protect us and save us? What if he used them to lord over us? These are Jewish Talmudic questions about the use of power that have been debated amongst far wiser Jews than myself, because I am an unlearned Jew. But during the Weisinger-Swan reign, we also got images like this. And when you look at an image like this, I do a whole lecture about the relationship of fine art to comic book art. We see Superman in a Christ-like position, taken down from the cross as one of the stations of the cross. If you actually look at the Superman origin, it's not only the Moses story, because for Jor-El so loved the earth, he gave his only begotten son with powers and abilities far beyond those of mortal men, that he might save the earth. In covers like this, there's as much of a Christological essence in Superman as there is the Mosaic aspect of Superman. Comic book artists and art directors and creators have made comments about this over the years. But seriously, back in 1966, this book was written, and it was the first book that went into serious detail about the Christological implications of a character like Superman. Sure, you could pass this off as kitsch. I found this image on the internet. But yet, this speaks to the very heart of Christ himself. And when you look at an image like this and you look at Superman and what he reveals, that all of us can act heroically and Christ-like when we pull off our fearful, scared human coverings and try to find the heroic, the Christ-like within us. The great artist who drew this, Alex Ross, is fully aware of the implications of Superman's Christ-like persona when he does paintings like this, that of course are based on the real Christ the Redeemer statue in Rio de Janeiro? Is that where that is? And again, look at the beautiful image that Ross creates. The films of late have picked up on the Christological implications of Superman deciding whether he can actually save the earth. This is the 2006 film. Look at how Ross, before that film, created images like this that are what informed that film. Look at how this image relates to what the recent film from 2013 did. And some of the recent books that have discussed the Christological implications of Superman under more secular titles like this use the Christ-like position to get across their idea of Superman. Now the flip side of Superman, the yang to Superman's yin, of course, is Batman, the next major superhero, and of course, he's not super. He's a man like you or I, created by Bob Kane, real name Khan, changed his name. He basically combines Zorro with the Shadow, who precede Batman, and that's how you get Batman. Except here's the thing. Batman was not just created by Bob Kane. He was created by his Jewish writer partner, Bill Finger, real name Milton. Bill Finger, to make a long story short, worked for DC Comics throughout the 40s, 50s, and 60s. He co-creates Green Lantern, Wildcat, Superboy, writes a whole bunch of things that this collage get across. But the main thing to know for Batman is that without Bill Finger, Batman never would have looked like this. I put together in 1999, based on Bob Kane's and Bill Finger's own recollections, what Bob Kane's first sketch looked like before he went to DC Comics. He showed it to his partner, Bill Finger. And according to both of them, this is what Batman first looked like. Without Bill Finger, there would be no Batman. Last year, for the 75th anniversary, I put together a lecture that looked like this. And I called Bill Finger the man who made Batman Batman. If you've read in the news recently, DC Comics and Warner Brothers have finally agreed to give Bill Finger credit on some of the many concepts he created. The Gotham TV show, Bill Finger named Gotham. In fact, the origin of Batman from 1939, shown here in its first full page, gives us the story that is as familiar as the Stations of the Cross, where Bruce Wayne's parents get murdered in front of his eyes. But here's the thing. When we actually look at the actual idea of a boy's parents being murdered, we have an interesting little connection with young Siegel and Schuster, who were working at DC Comics and were the reason why Bob Kane created Batman, because he saw Siegel and Schuster making a mountain of money after Superman becomes an overnight success, and says to the DC editor, how do I make that money? And Vin Sullivan, the editor, says, go create your own superhero. Well, it turns out that Jerry Siegel's father, back in 1932, the year before he creates Superman with Joe Shuster, was a men's clothing store owner in Cleveland. He gets held up. He doesn't get shot, killed, but he dies of a heart attack following the holdup. Now think about it. His father gets killed when Jerry Siegel is 18 years old. The very next year, he creates Superman, the ultimate father figure come down that can't get hurt, that can't die. And the idea of him seeing his father basically getting killed to create Superman, now when you look at the Bob Kane Batman origin written by Bill Finger, there's a good chance that maybe they knew about how Jerry Siegel's father was killed, and maybe that became a part of Batman's origin. Of course, he sees the bat fly out the window, and you get Batman. Over the years, Batman's been camp, he's been the Dark Knight. This is Neal Adams, one of the artists in my book, 1968. 3 months after the TV show is canceled, he creates what we know of as the Dark Knight of today. There would be no Dark Knight without what Neal Adams did. Now, look at this ad for the first Dark Knight movie, and look at this ad of the third movie with the idea that Batman is in the clouds, almost like the savior of Gotham City come from on high. And once again, I find this on the internet with the similar idea that Batman is actually us, that we can become heroes. We can become godlike if we spend 20 years training ourselves to physical and mental perfection, and of course we inherit the Wayne millions. But other than that little detail, we can become godlike. Now, to keep the religious theme, the trinity of early Jewish superheroes is created by these two American Jews, Jaime Simon, who changed his name to Joe, and that guy over there named Yaakov Kurtzberg. They're shown here in 1940 working for the early DC Comics doing the Boy Commandos, which was like a boys' gang of scrappers based on Jack Kirby growing up, Yaakov Kurtzberg, growing up on the Lower East Side, right here. And they're aware of what's happening in Europe with the rising tide of fascism, like a lot of American Jews were. And they wanted to do something to help. They saw the success of Superman and Batman. So what did they do? 9 months before America enters the war, they create Captain America. Joe Simon is a writer and an artist. That's actually his first drawing. And then when it actually got into the comic books, Jack Kirby actually drew that. If you look at the first Captain America, 1941, he's obviously the Uncle Sam myth taken from the previous 2 centuries and brought into modern times. If you remember the first Captain America movie, they paid homage to the idea that in real life, Captain America was so successful, they dressed up actors to hawk for war bonds right here in New York City. And this piece of art that I found off the internet pays homage to that. The origin of Captain America, where he gets injected with a super serum, comes from the stereotype of the Jewish scientist. You got to remember, scientists that were of German descent, like Albert Einstein, were leaving Nazi Germany to come to America. So you have that element at play in the origin of Captain America. But really, he's a Jewish hero fighting the Nazis at a time when America was isolationist. They didn't want to fight what was called Europe's war, and they certainly weren't going to fight a war to save the Jews. But I find it interesting that I found this last week on the internet that gets to the heart of what I'm talking about, that the very shield of Captain America should be a Jewish star. But Captain America, so successful in 1941, turns the entire brand new superhero world upside down, and sure enough, everybody starts fighting the war. This is why Superman, by proxy, actually starts going to fight World War II. DC Comics competition, Marvel Comics, in the early 40s, they have the Human Torch and the Submariner. They were fighting what were called the Jap-Nazi rats. Captain Marvel ends up fighting the war. They actually turn Uncle Sam into a superhero and give him his own comic. There were the Blackhawks, who were created by a Jewish writer-artist named Will Eisner, who did not change his name. In the wake of Superman, he's asked to create a superhero. He creates Wonder Man, which only lasted one issue because DC Comics looked at this, a guy holding a car over his head, and once again, Mark said it was copyright infringement and sued Wonder Man out of existence. Yeah, this is what your father does for a living. I know, tough. Anyway, so my point is, Will Eisner was so sick of superheroes just from this experience that when he's asked by a newspaper syndicate to create a superhero, not for a comic book itself, but for a comic book insert that would go into newspapers, and that lit up Eisner's eyes. And he ends up creating a detective called the Spirit. He doesn't give him superpowers. In fact, his only concession, this is the first story in 1940, but after the story, at the end of the origin, he's actually given a mask. This was as much as Eisner wanted to kowtow to the conventions of what made superheroes, is to give the guy a mask. But the Spirit appears in 7-page stories once a week in newspapers. And right from the beginning, Eisner shows himself to be adept at taking all the conventions of the comic book story and doing it in a way that nobody has really ever done it before or since. He would do these incredible, what are called splash pages, where he would play with the Spirit logo. He would get down to the depths of life in the city. This was film noir comic books before film noir. They might have influenced film noir. But Eisner's stories had a very kind of Sholem Aleichem, Jewish, mensch-like quality of the little guy against the system. And later on in the Spirit's run, about 1950, he does stories like this. Gerhard Schnabel is his name. He always wanted to fly. He's basically just a nothing, like a Willy Loman. And in this particular story, look at how Eisner plays with the conventions of mixing photography with comics. Eisner's basically the D.W. Griffith of comics. If D.W. Griffith of film created the crosscuts and the panning and the zooming, Eisner does this in comics. And that's how that particular story ends. Here's Eisner, I think in the maybe late 50s. In the 1970s, he's still working. And he creates, in 1978, what is considered really the first real graphic novel. It's actually not a single novel. It's actually made up of loosely interconnected stories, very similar to what Quentin Tarantino would do years later with Pulp Fiction. But the main story is about a rabbi who comes home after burying his own daughter. And he's totally disillusioned with the very idea of God itself, that God would permit his loving daughter to die. And he actually rages against God and basically says, didn't we have a contract where I would do good and teach and show people the way? and yet you took my daughter. And this is considered the first graphic novel. The stories that Eisner drew were right from the New York streets. This is a photograph of the tenement buildings of the early 20th and late 19th century. And when you look at Eisner's work in Contract with God, they literally look like they're torn from those same photographs. He kept working all through the 80s and 90s up until he dies in 2005, doing stories like this that were about New York itself, which was seen through a Jewish prism. Not the upscale life, but the street level life. One of the last graphic novels he did was about Fagin, the Jew, from the story of Oliver Twist, and trying to discover the tropes of anti-Semitism that would seep out into the larger culture. Similar to the way Shakespeare's Shylock from Merchant of Venice created the Jewish stereotype of the money-hungry Jew. The last graphic novel Eisner did was a graphic novel about the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which was an anti-Semitic tract created by the Tsarist secret police, but to this day is still sold in every Arab Middle Eastern country and is still online with the same old basic lie that the Jews control the world. This hasn't gone away. And Eisner, the work that was on his drawing board when he died, he just completed it, was his last graphic novel. Now, way back in the 40s, this wasn't the first time that heavy-duty issues were shown in comic book form. This is the first picture stories from the Bible that, remember our friend Max Gaines, Nee Ginsburg? He wanted to take the Bible stories and bring them into comic book form. And it was successful. And he called his company, when he left DC Comics in 1944, he called it Educational Comics, EC Comics. And this was successful, picture stories from science. Then in 1947, due to a quirk, he dies in a boating accident. And he gives the business to his 25-year-old son, Bill Gaines. And Bill Gaines, in the late 40s, turns the company from Educational Comics with his partner, the editor and writer Al Feldstein, by the way, did not change his name, and they create the infamous or famous EC Comics of the early 50s. Their horror comics were more horrible than any horror comics ever made. Their science fiction comics were years ahead of their time, with twist-ending stories that anticipated Rod Serling's The Twilight Zone by a decade. Their crime and suspense stories were adult themes that had never been shown in comic books. They also tackled issues of anti-immigration, anti-Semitism that were torn from the headlines of their day that we're still dealing with, but they did it in the early 50s at a time when nobody touched issues like this, like the Ku Klux Klan still around in early 50s in the Deep South. The EC Comics are considered legendary. The third great creator is the guy on the right, also a Jew who didn't change his name, Harvey Kurtzman. Why is Harvey Kurtzman one of the most influential Jewish comic creators? Well, he only created this thing. It starts out as a comic book called Mad in 1953. They start as spoofs of other comic strips illustrated by the same guys that were doing those science fiction and horror comics. They loved doing these spoofs of superheroes. Nobody was spoofing American cultural icons. It's part of our culture now, but it was Harvey Kurtzman that takes these beloved icons in the early 50s and lampoons them in a way that actually to this day have never been done as well. He introduces Hebrew and Yiddish vernacular into the mainstream, ganefs, and words like meshugana and verschlugener. This was Life magazine, the same month that this Mad magazine issue came out. The young underground artists that would create underground comics a decade later, like Robert Crumb, saw covers like this and their lives were changed. Robert Crumb single-handedly creates underground comics a year later, not Jewish, but he's what we call, he has got a Yiddish cup, because his comics have that Harvey Kurtzman attitude and angst to them, and it all comes out of the comic book Mad. Anyway, then, due to circumstances that I do a whole nother lecture about, Mad becomes a magazine in 1955 to avoid being put out of business because of the witch hunts in the 50s about how comics caused juvenile delinquency. And this is the Mad that you probably know, Mad magazine. Out of Mad comes Underground Comics, comes Harvard Lampoon, comes the National Lampoon, comes Saturday Night Live. The entire history of Jewish humor in post-war America, from stand-ups to Saturday Night Live, comes out of Harvey Kurtzman's Mad. He also did war comics at a time of the Korean War. Now, in the wake of World War II, all of American culture was still propagating the war hero, America, as the great world conqueror. And the war comics of Kurtzman's time kept up this phony charade of the heroic American soldier in the face of all odds. But that wasn't the war stories that Kurtzman wanted to tell. Kurtzman, in his own cartoony style, was able to make subject matter like this feel more raw and real. To most Kurtzman aficionados, we love Harvey Kurtzman's own artwork versus the sketches he did for other artists to illustrate. This is one of his most famous stories called If, all about a grunt, a GI, who basically dies at the end of the story because if only he hadn't made that left turn versus that right turn. And as his life seeps away, he realizes that it was all about if. Now, this is a very fatalistic kind of Jewish mentality to tell a story like this about a single soldier. And this is, again, ostensibly in a medium directed at 8-year-old boys. And yet this was the greatness of Harvey Kurtzman and of EC Comics. As they were about to be put out of business by the powers that be in America, 1955, one of their last science fiction stories, written by Gaines and Feldstein, illustrated by Joe Orlando, about an American Earthman who comes to this planet peopled by robots in order to see if they've elevated their consciousnesses enough to join the Federation of Planets, like every Star Trek episode you've ever seen. And it turns out that the orange robots don't think much of the blue robots. And they keep the blue robots in chains. And the orange robots lord it over them. And they realize, the Earthman realizes they're not elevated consciously to be brought into the Federation of Planets. So he tells them, you guys have a lot of work to do. And he flies off in his spaceship. And the very last panel that Gaines and Feldstein had a fight to keep in is the first realistic drawing of a black man in comic book history. This drawing when the spaceman takes off his helmet. It was stories like this that influenced the generation that became the 60s generation that fought in the streets for civil rights because of comic book stories like this that appeared in EC Comics. They adapted stories from a young Ray Bradbury. One of the last stories they did in Impact in 1955, I think, was a story called Master Race by the great Jewish artist Bernard Krigstein, who eventually became disenchanted with comics and became a fine art painter and an educator. But he does this story, again, written by Gaines and Feldstein, about a Holocaust survivor. Remember, this is 1955. This is not last week. This is 60 years ago. And he's recognized. And you get panels like this at a time when America was just beginning to confront the horror of the Holocaust in photographs like this. And that's why comic books have always been years ahead of what the rest of the culture is doing. In the mid-50s, we revisit Jaime Simon named Joe and Yaakov Kurtzberg, Jack Kirby. They create a Captain America knockoff in the 50s. That sells for a little while. Then overnight, they create the entire genre of romance comics, which we still have today in various forms. Look at this cover and look at what's considered the very first pop art painting. It's actually a collage, and it's only about this big. And it's actually created by an Englishman named Richard Hamilton. And it's got a very long, unwieldy title. What is it about today's homes that make them so appetizing and appealing? I may not have all the words right, but it's called pop art because the He-Man here is holding a Tootsie Pop, and some early reviewer called it pop art. But look at the back wall. What do we see there? But we see the Young Romance cover by Simon and Kirby. So comic books and pop art were linked way before Roy Lichtenstein did his first pop art panel. At around the same time, in the 1950s in America, you were being shown images like this of the popular motifs: speed, space, technology. And those were the themes overriding the pop culture in that decade. Well, somebody up at DC Comics in 1955 said, hey, remember those superheroes we used to publish, like The Flash? This was the first issue in 1940. All the superheroes had died out after the end of World War II, like they had nothing to do. And they were replaced by genres like the horror and science fiction comics. But somebody up at DC, and nobody knows for sure, said, what if we bring the Flash back, but not the same exact Flash? Now, we talk about the word reboots in pop culture now. The recreation of the Flash in 1956 is really the first pop culture reboot in American pop culture history, and kicks off what became known as the Silver Age of comics, i.e. the 1960s, whereas the 1940s are considered the Golden Age. And the architects of the DC Comics Silver Age were, as usual, a couple of Jews. Erwin Donenfeld, the son of Harry, is the guy that shepherds DC Comics through the Silver Age. The editor who's responsible for The Flash and all the other DC rebooted heroes is named Julius Schwartz. After The Flash, they do Green Lantern. He's the next superhero in 1959 to be created by the artist Gil Kane. Now look at his sleek design versus the Golden Age Green Lantern. Look how the outfits were baggy, like magicians' cloaks, versus the more skin-tight outfit. Now, the early Green Lantern was created by the Jewish artist Martin Nodell. But the Silver Age Green Lantern, shown here meeting his Golden Age counterpart, is created by this artist named Gil Kane, who starts his career as a teenager in the 1940s as Eli Katz. Changes his name. The Green Lanterns are given their powers by these giant chrome-domed characters named the Guardians of the Galaxy, but Gil Kane says he based them on David Ben-Gurion. If you look at him and you look at art that Gil Kane does later, you can kind of see the David Ben-Gurion feeling. Now, I think we're all in agreement that Pretty Boy over here was a lousy Green Lantern, but that's a whole nother discussion. The next rebooted DC hero of the Silver Age is the Atom, also drawn by Gil Kane. There is his sleek design, but he also is a rebooted character for the 1940s. He had no scientifically based superhero. He was just a little guy that was pretty strong. So he was like a mighty mite, and they called him the Atom. Maybe the stupidest costume in comic book history, but again, that's a whole nother lecture. They all get together and form the Justice League of America in 1960, and that really puts DC Comics on top. Meanwhile, their competition, the Pepsi to their Coke, was a little company called Atlas Comics. They used to be Marvel Comics back in the 40s, but they weren't even called Marvel in the 40s. They were called Timely Comics. And their publisher was a nice Jewish boy named Martin Goodman. Martin Goodman was notoriously cheap. That's why he hired his nephew, Stanley Lieber, who changed his name to Stan Lee, was his nephew, and he was the head writer and editor of Atlas Comics all through the 40s and 50s. He later teams up with Jack Kirby, and together in 1961, they kick off what we now know of as the Marvel Comics universe with the first issue of the Fantastic Four in 1961. You can see how, according to Martin Goodman, the type of publisher was just copy whatever was successful. Look at how the Fantastic Four is essentially their take on the Justice League of America, where they took some of their rebooted heroes, like the Human Torch was from the 40s, and they bring him up to date. Here is the last image in the very first Fantastic Four comic, and you look at the character third from the left there. He ends up being the standout character of the series. He's the Thing. And maybe the most famous story of the Thing appears in 1966 in that melancholy image. You can see traces of the Golem in the Thing itself. The fact that it's coupled with the orange skin. This is, again, a statue in Prague. According to Kirby himself, he called this a self-portrait. Why? Because he said of all the characters he created, the Thing was most like his own personality. He says the Thing moved like him, talked like him, acted like him. And that's why he identified mostly with the Thing. Look at this Hanukkah card that he makes his relatives, which shows the sort of Jewish origins, but like all Jewish culture in America, it was always subsumed beneath the surface. Look how one of his trademark clobber in time has been co-opted in another piece of art I found on the internet. It's Daven in time. Now, some of the stories Kirby told with Lee had a very Jewish feeling to them. In 1963, they do a story about the hate monger, who's obviously a thinly disguised version of the Ku Klux Klan that during the Civil Rights era was on the rise. At the end of the story, they take off his dunce cap there, and who do they find but Adolf Hitler, who never died? You know, the beginning of those conspiracy theories. Anyway, Fantastic Four is successful. The Thing is the most popular character. So Goodman, the Jewish salesman knockoff artist, says, hey, let's do another character like that. So the next character to appear is the Hulk in 1962. Now the Hulk is another Golem. Look, same type of thing. The big lumbering monster-like character. Now a lot of people think the Hulk's origin comes from the Jekyll and Hyde split personality. Nope. Remember our friend Frankenstein here? In 1961, the biggest selling toy was the very first Aurora monster model, which was colored green because the movie was in black and white, but since they wanted a full color cover, they gave him the color green. Well, Martin Goodman, ever aware of what was selling, said to Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, listen, can you give me a superhero version of Frankenstein, the biggest selling toy of 1961? And that's why you have the Hulk colored green. The first issue they colored him gray. They forgot about his dictum to make him like Frankenstein. So starting with issue 2, you get the green skin colored Hulk, which is the Hulk that you know and love now from movies on his own and of course with the Avengers and everybody. Then comes Spider-Man in 1962. A recent article postulated, is Spider-Man Jewish? Now, why would they say that? What is it about Spider-Man? Well, Lee first gives it to Jack Kirby to draw, but Kirby's superhero characters weren't what Lee was looking for. He gives the job to a not Jewish artist named Steve Ditko. Steve Ditko is the guy that comes up with the Spider-Man costume design, maybe the most unique costume in comic book history. That's why the movies have been so successful, because it was the design that Ditko came up with. But the idea of Spider-Man comes out of a Jewish sensibility of irony, that at the end, he doesn't get his powers and go to fight crime. He gets his powers and uses them selfishly. And by using them selfishly to make money, he learns a very difficult lesson. With great power comes great responsibility. And he doesn't save his Uncle Ben because he's too busy thinking of himself. The greatest thing a man can do is give his own life for his friends. But that's not what Spider-Man does. He has to learn that. Now, look at the parallel between the origins of Batman with Spider-Man. That's interesting to point out. Both have a Jewish quality to them. He blames the guilt of his own parents being killed in front of his eyes. He blames that on himself as a child and works it out becoming Batman. Whereas Peter Parker blames himself in an unconscious way. That both deal with the guilt of having not saved their parents. Because this is what Spider-Man does. Kind of like reality television ahead of its time. This is 1962. He basically goes on the Ed Sullivan Show and makes money. And there's the panel where he walks past the guard. It was Steve Ditko's crude artwork with Stan Lee's writing, which was fresh and alive, compared to the phoniness of the DC product with the over 30 superhero. This is in the early 60s, before the 60s and the generation gap. And look at the difference in attitude towards authority between the slick DC characters on the right and the more ground level, raw Spider-Man on the left. The idea that the hero could actually be treated like the bad guy. I mean, images like this were never seen in DC Comics, but they were seen in the Marvel Comics, and Steve Ditko's art was able to get across the kind of neurotic nature of Spider-Man. Peter Parker was a nebbish compared to the slick, self-assured, over 30 DC character. And it's this quality that is responsible for why we're still asking today, is Spider-Man Jewish? The next thing they create is the character Thor. Look how thin Thor starts out. He's the lame Dr. Donald Blake who strikes his cane and becomes Thor in here, the very first episode. In a couple of years, Jack Kirby's art would mature and you would get this bulkier Thor that became the character we know and love. Kirby had an awareness of the ancient myths because his parents, the Eastern European Jews, taught him all those stories when he was growing up. And that's why you got images like this that are modern mythological versions of the Jewish legends like Samson. You get Kirby's Pietà versus the Pietà that you're familiar with. Where's that Pope when you need him? Pope! I told you he'd find something of interest here. In 1968, Kirby does a story about a villain called Mangog who is running across Asgard, leaving death and destruction in its wake. Where do you find the biblical origins of Mangog? Well, there's the legends in Hebrew literature of Gog and Magog, who are considered these giant evil gods that are going to descend upon the Holy Land and bring on Armageddon. Now, somehow that weaves its way into a story about Thor fighting Mangog. But Kirby himself fought in World War II. Who can be seen in Kirby's background as storming across Europe, waging war and destruction in its wake? It was Kirby's way of dealing with his World War II past. Here he's shown in his outfit. In 1963, he brings Iron Man to Stan Lee in Marvel Comics. He starts out in the bulky silver outfit. You might remember from the first Robert Downey film how they paid homage to that. The red and yellow armored Iron Man is the one you're more familiar with, and that comes from the artist who took over after Kirby, named Gene Colan, one of the great Marvel Comics artists in my book. Gene Colan passed away a couple years ago. He kept a secret until he died, his real last name, Cohen. Then in 1963, Kirby and Lee create the X-Men. The X-Men have become the most popular franchise that really set off 15 years ago the movies that we have today. Look at the way Kirby and Lee create him. This is their version of Dr. Doom, the X-Men's prime villain, Magneto. You can see the way the movies have really kept the integrity of Kirby's design. Now, when you look at an image like this of Magneto, what does that remind you of, you art lovers out there? But one of Roy Lichtenstein's most famous paintings, ironically titled The Image Duplicator. Now, you might know Lichtenstein more from all of the romance comics that he was doing paintings of. Here's a shot of one of them in his studio in 1965 at the peak of the pop art craze. Roy Lichtenstein, nice Jewish boy, would take comic book panels like this and not just trace them like a robot, but as a graphic designer would, he transformed them into what we now know as pop art. In 1965, pop art is so successful and is such a craze that for a couple of months, Marvel Comics actually calls their comics pop art productions. That same year, in 1965, Kirby does this cover. Only Jack Kirby could have pulled off a cover like this that shows every character he either created or co-created with Lee of what became the Marvel Comics universe. But there's a couple characters that he created that you don't see there because they were created after 1965. You've got this guy, the Watcher, who comes from the biblical watchers from the books of Judges, I believe, who were just watching what was happening and recording life as it was going on. And he is actually heralding the coming of Galactus. Galactus is Kirby's most godlike character. Starts out in the sort of Christmassy red and green motif, but by the very next issue, he's in his more popular purple and brown ensemble. But according to Kirby, he said when he created Galactus, he was looking for God on the cover page. And you can see in images like this, the godlike aura that he imbues Galactus with. Now in 1966, when this issue comes out, all comic book fans were saying, what the hell is that guy in the center there? Is that a guy on a surfboard? Yes, it's the Silver Surfer. And in Kirby's worldview, he plays the fallen angel who gets sent down to Earth for disobeying God or Galactus. And that's where you get the kind of Jewish take on the Silver Surfer. But in Kirby's hands, he becomes this majestic being. Hollywood was trying to make a Silver Surfer movie for years, but because the special effects could never actually make us believe a man can fly on a surfboard, we only finally got the Silver Surfer in 2008 when they did this movie, which, wasn't so bad. But Kirby kept up his godlike ideas and eventually left Marvel Comics in 1970 and went to DC Comics and continued his stories about what he called the new gods, which were his ideas of the gods that would come after the old gods, meaning the ones he did for Marvel Comics in the 60s. And even at the same time he's doing these, he's creating portfolios that have nothing to do with comic book images themselves, but you can see that he's still concerned with characters as gods. And he does these black and white plates that he never really discusses too much, and you have to read into them what you choose to. But there is Kirby's vision of God here. And look at this plate and how God, up there in the left there, is looking at his creation of Earth and only seeing a war-torn planet that man has basically turned it into, to the point where Kirby has his God turning his back on man. A very pessimistic worldview for Jack Kirby. I mean, when you look at the classic image by Michelangelo, Kirby was the Michelangelo of comics. The myriad, the cornucopia of characters Kirby creates. You like that alliteration? Did anybody appreciate that? The cornucopia, okay. But anyway, that's what Jack Kirby does. Look at his gravestone, and you can see that he never forgot his Jewishness. He always, even though he was one of the Jews that changed his name, there is how he was buried when he dies in 1994. The credits that Kirby got all throughout the 60s called him the king, but some of the other creators of comics were Jewish and had an impact. He had letterers like Artie Simek, colorers like Stan Goldberg, who recently passed away. Remember I told you the head colorist of DC Comics, Jack Adler, and his nephew Howard Stern? Then you had Sal Brodsky. We don't even have photographs of these guys. Sometimes all we have are portraits that were done by comic artists. You have his doppelganger at DC Comics, longtime production manager, Sal Harrison. All Jews, all sons of European Jewish immigrants that peopled the comic book world. One of the great artists for DC Comics, also didn't change his name, was Joe Kubert, passed away in 2012. He co-creates Sergeant Rock, the great World War II hero for DC Comics, with his soulmate writer-editor, Robert Kanigher, that he does this portrait of, and one of the other great Jews of comics. In 1965, in the backup feature in Sergeant Rock, they titillate the audience with this cover asking you who they would not dare show on the cover. And that ended up being the story of Enemy Ace, a World War I German ace as the star of a comic book. Appearing in the middle of the 1960s, this was pretty radical. Okay, they're not showing a Nazi as a hero, but having a German hero was pretty radical. And this appears in 1968, the same year that Kubert does this cover, appearing right in the middle of 1968, the real beginning of the anti-war movement in full swing. I asked Joe Kubert in 2003 when I interviewed him, Joe, you can't tell me that an image like this, even though he's a World War II sergeant, is not a statement against the Vietnam War. And Kubert was like, Arlen, it wasn't. We were just kind of saying war is hell. And I say in my book about this image that just because an artist can articulate why they did something doesn't mean that ideas are in the ether, in the zeitgeist, and they penetrate, and you might create something without actually knowing why you created it, but it doesn't mean this wasn't an anti-Vietnam War statement, whether they articulated it or not. Look at this cover in 1969. That's essentially about a hippie who doesn't want to go to war. In the story, he uses his guitar to save Sergeant Rock from being killed by a Nazi by smashing the guitar over the Nazi's head, and in doing so loses his own life. No greater gift a man can do than lay down his life for that of his brothers and friends. And that's how Kubert ends the story. Look at this Sergeant Rock story from 1971. Again, takes place in World War II, but the idea of a soldier killing civilians was taken right from the 1969 My Lai story in Vietnam that made it onto the cover of the New York Times Sunday magazine. Kubert, throughout his career, would never shy away from doing stories with Bob Kanigher that had Jewish themes to them at a time that it wasn't au courant to have Jewish themes in comics. Look at how this story ends with a tattered rag of the Hebrew star, the Star of David that Jews had to wear in Europe to identify their Judaism. Kubert later in 1976 co-creates with Kanigher this superhero called Ragman. He pays homage to his own great Enemy Ace cover from 8 years earlier when he does Ragman. Ragman comes right out of the schmata trade here in New York City. He's called the tatterdemalion. Nobody had ever heard the word tatterdemalion. Nobody even knows to this day what a tatterdemalion is. But that's the great thing about comics. They gave us a vocabulary, as my grandmother used to say, a vocabulary like none other. But that's what Ragman was. And you know what? The Jewish origins that in 1976 weren't quite overtly stated, but they were enough there, that Ragman, even in Kubert's death, has become a mainstay of the DC Comics universe, and they've actually had stories that dealt with Ragman and his Jewish origins in stories like this that dealt with the Holocaust. Kubert, again, never shied away from his Judaism, and in the later part of his career did some pretty intense, great graphic novels about growing up in the New York area, Brooklyn, where there was the Jewish mob. And these are a couple panels from these great stories. Kubert, man, these graphic novels he does at the last stage of his career are some of the greatest. He does this graphic novel, Yassel, that postulated, what if he, when he was a child born in Poland in 1938, and then they left right away, and he says, what if I hadn't left? What if I, as a child, remained in Poland during the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising? And he does a graphic novel in pencil, beautifully drawn, so sensitive about the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising from the point of view of he himself witnessing it as a young artist child, drawing what was happening in front of him. One of his last Sergeant Rock stories for DC Comics, a couple of years before he dies in 2012, dealt with Sergeant Rock and Easy Company going across Russia to Latvia. These are all sites of Jewish massacres by both the Nazi troops. And it's actually torn from real stories. And their mission is to protect a child that is considered to be, of this Jewish sect, the Messiah. And they've got to protect his life at all costs. The last 30 years of his life, Kubert very quietly contributed to a Jewish newspaper called the Moshiach Times, where every, I think, month, I'm not sure, but he would have a story from the Jewish biblical past. One of his fellow writers at DC Comics, Arnold Drake, a Jewish writer, in 1967 comes up with a character called Deadman. What makes Deadman kind of unique and with a kind of a Jewish sensibility? He's a circus acrobat that gets shot to death in the middle of his trapeze performance. And when he hits ground, he's not dead. He gets up. and he walks to the light. And all of a sudden, a spirit in a tree that identifies itself as the Hindu spirit Rama Krishna speaks to him. This story appears in 1967, the same year that the Beatles go to visit the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi and learning about ideas of Eastern mysticism and reincarnation. And Drake is aware of this, and they're trying to compete with Marvel Comics. And he says, we've got to do stuff that's happening right now. And in that very first Deadman story, Deadman now can inhabit other people's bodies and try to find his own killer. He busts up an opium ring. This is 1967. The Comics Code said you couldn't do stories about opium. But in that very first story, Arnold Drake gets that through. What also makes Deadman significant is that an issue later, this young artist named Neal Adams takes over Deadman. Neal Adams had this hyper-realistic style. He wasn't Jewish, but Adams had what we call a Yiddish cup. There was a Jewish sensibility operating in his work. He's the one that did the great Batman. In this 1971 story, Batman confronts a real-life Grim Reaper who's going around killing people. And it turns out that he's a Jewish doctor who survived the Holocaust. But it got him a little nuts, and he ended up, just like the Golem, killing the good people as well as the people that he deemed evil. And they're on a dam, and he's about to kill one of Batman's friends there when he notices the Jewish star dangling from his scythe. And he says, "What have I become?" And he falls off the dam to his death that we see in this beautifully drawn sequence by Neal Adams. The same year, for National Lampoon magazine, he does a series of stories with a non-Jewish writer called Son of God. And they're actually pretty funny stories, all about how it's God's turn to create a Messiah. All the other religions have had their turn, and they decide to get a nice Jewish boy, and when he yells the words Jesus Christ, he becomes Son of God. Drawn by Neal Adams, and they're pretty funny, pretty sacrilegious, of course, like all of National. But remember, this comes out of Mad magazine. But Adams always had a Jewish consciousness to his work. A couple of years ago, he does a graphic story about a real-life Holocaust survivor who used her art to stay alive by drawing portraits for the camp commandant of the other inmates. And Adams gets involved with trying to get their art back from the Museum of Auschwitz that won't give it up. So Adams, to help out the fund by this woman, creates this story talking about what she had to go through, and in the present time, as she got older, trying to get her art back. Now, Neal Adams said, he was born in 1941. He talks about how nobody entered comics when he did. They were either 5 years older or 5 years younger. Well, one guy did enter comics, the great Robert Crumb. Not Jewish, but again, a righteous Gentile with that Jewish sensibility. He marries Arlen Kaminsky, Jewish girl. She's like the queen of underground comics to his king. If you've never read anything by Arlen Kaminsky, she really lets it all hang out. I consider her to be the greatest female cartoonist really of all time. But nobody really knows her work because she's been in the shadow of her more famous husband, Robert Crumb, who just recently took the book of Genesis and did it in comic book form. I was just at the Jewish Museum up the street there, and they've got this in their gift shop. But I mean, people who thought Robert Crumb would never do something as literal as the Bible, well, he does a pretty straight-on version of the exact book of Genesis. And you really got to pick it up. Crumb's peer was the great Art Spiegelman. There's a picture of him. That was a drawing by Spiegelman. In 1977, he comes out of the underground comic movement. He puts together a collection that's really beautiful. You should track it down, called Breakdowns. And one of the great stories that he does in 1968 is considered one of the greatest autobiographical comics ever done. And it's about growing up the son of Holocaust survivors. And he talks about how when he was 18 years old, he came out of a mental institution, and he came home to find out his mother had committed suicide. And if you can track down the story, it's pretty powerful. And he talks about how at the end, that by his mother committing suicide, it left him a prisoner. After he does this story, he decides to talk to his father, a Holocaust survivor. And in the late 70s, he does this story called Mouse, which ends up being the model for the graphic novel he would do later. He took the story of the Holocaust, but in a brilliant move, in an anthropomorphic move, cast the Nazis as cats and the Jews as mice, totally subverting the whole Disney kind of funny animal cartoon thing. And that story gets a great reaction, and because of that, he goes on almost a 15-year period creating the great graphic novel Mouse that appears first in 1986 in part 1, and then part 2 completes in 1992. What makes Mouse great on so many levels is that in addition to the recollections of his father from Auschwitz, he's also giving him first-person recollections of their life in the present time. So the story goes back and forth between the present time interviewing his father and also flashbacks to what it was like to actually be in Auschwitz. One of the great independent cartoonists named Dave Sim, influenced by what Spiegelman does in Mouse, he's doing his character Cerberus, which is a derivation of Cerberus, the Greek character. Cerberus is an aardvark, but it's a very intense story. There's a whole lecture I could do on how great Dave Sim Cerberus is. But after he does Cerberus, in 2006, he does a graphic novel called Judenhaus, which is the German word for Jew hatred. And in this story, which is really him doing beautiful pen and ink drawings of Auschwitz and the Nazi concentration camp experience, he talks about how every artist, whether you're Jewish or not, should do at least once in their lifetime some kind of work that pays homage to the Holocaust in order to keep it alive. And he really does these incredibly beautiful, sensitive pen and ink drawings that you've seen from all the horrible, terrible photographs of the concentration camps, but by rendering them in beautiful drawings and at the same time telling the same story of Jews and comics that I'm telling about how all the original comics were created by Jews. That had an influence on this guy, Harvey Kurtzman, the Jewish writer, comic book writer from Cleveland. In 1976, he creates American Splendor. Some of the early stories are drawn by his friend Robert Crumb. This has a very Jewish sensibility because it's not about superheroes. It's Harvey Kurtzman himself directly addressing the audience one-on-one. And there was something about the power and the simplicity of Crumb's drawings and Kurtzman's words that made Kurtzman's work become an institution. Over the years, he would do graphic novels about what it was like to grow up in Cleveland. And there was so much Jewish culture that Kurtzman was proud of that he gets across in these graphic novels. He actually does a compendium of Yiddishisms that he calls Yiddishkeit. That was one of his last graphic works. He always worked with different artists. This is his last graphic novel that the artist J.T. Waldman completed after his death. J.T. Waldman is a great Jewish artist and writer in his own right. He came to fame a couple years before that graphic novel by doing the Megillah in graphic novel form, called the Megillat Esther. And his page layouts and design and typography using real Hebrew lettering to tell the story we're all familiar with if we've all gone to Purim ceremonies and heard the Megillah. But J.T. Waldman's work you got to experience. Ben Katcher is a New York-based artist that did stories from the streets with a very Jewish sensibility that he called Julius Nipple. And even though the drawings are very childlike and crude, they have a reality to them about the real New York that you can see how he turned into these very cartoony drawings. When you see drawings like this, you kind of know what that place feels like if you've lived in New York or been down to the Lower East Side, to the point where Katcher actually called one of his graphic novel collections the Jew of New York. And the Golem legend is alive and well in current Jewish comic creators. Look at how that's an Israeli comic. Marvel comic tried a Golem in the 1970s and actually tried to make him a superhero. There's been a Jewish-themed comic for many years called Mindy and the Golem. Look at this recent graphic novel, all about a team of Jewish ball players called The Golem's Mighty Swing. That's a page from the graphic novel. David Klein, a Jewish artist in Brooklyn, just recently completed his graphic novel, The Golem's Voice, that takes place in World War II and goes back to that temple in Prague where the Golem is being housed, and they bring the Golem back to life to fight the Nazis. So we kind of come full circle with the Golem being again currently used in comics. Now, the war against the Jews back in the Second Intifada, 2002, I was home. What can I do to help Israel? I don't have the money to give to Israel. But you know, I thought about two Jews named Joe Simon and Yaakov Kurtzberg. Well, they wanted to raise consciousness of what was happening over in Europe, so they created Captain America, right? Well, I thought to myself, you know, I've always loved Kirby's Captain America. In my own illustration work, I would do things like this, and I would always play off of Captain America. This was for Print Magazine, an art superhero that looks like Captain America. For a financial magazine about the foreign networks, because ABC had the round shield design, he becomes my Captain America. And I thought to myself, if two Jews can create Captain America, well, one American Jew can create Captain Israel. So my very first drawing I tried to base on the Captain America drawings I was so familiar with, and I put this on the light box and actually traced that over, and that became, in 2002, my very first image of Captain Israel, which became that, and I called him a superhero for our time. I'm not really a connected Jew to Jewish organizations, but I tried to get the character around to kind of help Israel. And the origin I came up with about how a disaffected American Jew named Michael David becomes a victim of a suicide bomb in Israel. His life was miraculously saved when an Israeli scientist transformed the shrapnel lodged in his brain with an experimental microchip, cybergenetically enhancing David's physical and mental abilities 1,000-fold. Armed with the strength of Samson and the mind of Einstein, David, spiritually reborn, strives for the wisdom of Solomon as Captain Israel, fighting the scourges of terrorism and anti-Semitism as he guards the lives, laws, and way of life of Israelis and Jews worldwide. In the very first issue that I ended up doing in 2010, 8 years later, with Stand With Us, a pro-Israel organization in Los Angeles, we thought it would be best if we just told the story of how Israel came to be in comic book form. So I go back and research that a lot of people don't realize the name Palestine itself was named by the Romans after they kicked all the Jews out, after they destroyed Jerusalem in 70 AD, and then after the Bar Kokhba rebellion. And they named Israel Palestine after the biblical enemies, the Philistines. People don't realize that. Then we go forward in time. It's kind of like a docu-comic where I talk about how the state of Israel is formed and how Theodor Herzl, a Jewish Austrian playwright and journalist, covers the Dreyfus Affair in 1895 and is in the streets of Paris hearing death to the Jews. And he comes up with the idea for the state of Israel. And he predicts that in 50 years there will be a state of Israel. And he dies a year later. But his dream came true. And isn't it funny that a couple years ago, there was death to the Jews in the streets of France just recently. So what's really changed? But because of one man, Theodor Herzl, we get the state of Israel. And in this image, we talk about after World War II and how Israel was formed and partitioned. If you take away the inset images, you're left with this image, which I've got to believe is the first pro-Israeli army image ever created. But I based it on every Captain America World War II image I had ever seen. The second issue that I did with Stand With Us in 2011 was about the BDS movement. And in order to give the background to the BDS movement, which is really just a modern version of the same old anti-Semitism, I go back to the history of anti-Semitism, starting with the medieval charge of deicide, that Jews killed Christ, into the medieval times, the book written by Martin Luther, the creator of the Protestant religion. He thought the Jews of Wittenberg, Germany would fight with him against the Catholic Church. The Jews said, listen, we're fine over here, you go do your thing. Well, guess what? He writes a book called On the Jews and Their Lies, which ends up becoming the blueprint for the Nazis 400 years later. Everything Martin Luther says to do to the Jews, burn them, enslave them, kill them, destroy their Torah, the Nazis did 400 years later. And there it is. And it builds up to the current BDS movement, which we pictured as a giant snake that Captain Israel is falling victim to. And we go up to the present time and the current BDS movement and what's happening on college campuses and everywhere. This was a couple years ago, 2011, and of course it's still going on. But there's Captain Israel. He doesn't know what to do, so he decides that if he summons what I call the Israel light, the light of knowledge, for people worldwide, not just fellow Jews, to stand up and fight against evil, that we can defeat the anti-Semitic BDS snake. And at the end, I've got Captain Israel literally defanging the BDS movement. And when you close the cover, there's the final image of a triumphant Captain Israel. I wanted to do a third issue about the Arab Spring. It never got past the sketch stage because I kind of had a falling out with Stan with Us, which is a whole nother story. But the point is that this is what I wanted to see with Captain Israel, that he'd be able to tell the story of what was happening from a pro-Israel, pro-Jewish point of view through the superhero that the Jews created. The super Jews. I ended up developing this lecture that I've been doing. At times, if I'm just dealing about superheroes themselves, I've called it Super Jews. Of course, we've got this current lecture, Jews and Comics. You can see here in my promo, my book, The Silver Age of comic book art. There's the title page of all the great artists that we've been talking about. I would say half of them are Jews. You've got guys like Infantino and Steve Ditko in the book, not Jewish, but then you've got, of course, the great Yaakov Kurtzberg. You've got Eli Katz. Joe Kubert didn't change his name. Gene Cohen. Steranko, not Jewish. But all these not Jews have Yiddish cups. And then, of course, Neal Adams. I do a lecture based on the Silver Age this weekend on Saturday down at the Baltimore Comic Convention. I'll be doing that. I'll also be doing my lecture on the 75th anniversary of The Spirit, which I'm really looking forward to. That'll be Sunday in Baltimore. He's one of the great Jews in comics. The little brochures that everybody has, you can get a poster of this image along with some of my other images. And I'm an equal opportunity religious icon creator. I'll be having an art show of many of these images where I live in Westport, Connecticut, starting October 22nd. If anybody wants to make the schlep up to Westport, email me for details. When you close the brochure, there's information about my book. There's also an ebook version, but of course I recommend the print version because that's why I did the book. When you take off the silver dust jacket, there's a wraparound cover illustration of all the heroes. Pretty rare for Marvel and DC to allow a joint character illustration. Up in the corner, of course, is Superman, my first favorite artist, Kurt Swan. The very last page of my book is a one-page autobiography where I talk about what influenced me as a child growing up that made me do this book. The comic I'm holding is that very first comic book I saw when I was 5 years old in summer camp in 1963. Here I am, there's that comic book on the ground. That's my idea of Mount Rushmore. That's a postcard I sent to my mother from 7 years old from summer camp. Other kids send money, send candy. I sent her that. In the lower half of the illustration, that's me in 8th grade. Pay attention, you, right here. 8th grade, giving an oral report on the lawsuit between Superman and Captain Marvel, 8th grade. Doing visual aids for extra credit. Do they still have visual aids for extra credit in school? What happened? What happened? Anyway, Anyway, the very last panel, back when I had a goatee there, of course, a friend of mine gave me this quote once and said, Arlen, this quote is you. And I read it, and she was right. It said, it's a quote by Albert Camus, not Jewish, the great existentialist poet, who said, a man's work is nothing but the slow trek to rediscover through the detours of art those 2 or 3 great and simple images in whose presence his heart first opened. Thank you.